Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. So pseudo-classes are a way for us in CSS to select elements based on their current state in the DOM. For example, we might want to select just the inputs that are currently disabled. Pseudo-elements are very similar, but they allow us to select certain portions of an element. For example, we might want to select the first letter or the first line of a paragraph, and we can do that using pseudo-elements. Before we get started on that, let's briefly take a look at the HTML file we have here for the demo. So we have a heading in H1 that says Hello World. Below that, we have a paragraph that says Go to AlgoExpert with a link to algoexpert.io. Then we have two paragraphs, AlgoExpert is the best and Front-End Expert is the best. And finally, we have an input of type text with a label that just says input. And of course, in the head, we are linking in our styles.css file. With that, let's move over to the styles.css file, and we can start writing our first pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes use a colon and then the name of the class. So for example, we can say :link, and what this will select is links, but specifically ones that are unvisited, meaning the user has not clicked on it. And we can do this on the anchor tag if we want. And then inside of the rule set, we can write any normal CSS declarations, such as color red, and this will make the AlgoExpert text turn red. However, if I come to the browser and click on AlgoExpert, it will take us to the AlgoExpert website, of course. Then we hit back, and you'll see the text is now purple. So why is this? Why is the text no longer red? Well, the selector we wrote was on the link pseudo-class, and the link pseudo-class only selects unvisited links. So once I clicked on AlgoExpert, it became a visited link, and this was no longer selecting it. However, we can say anchor tags that are visited, and this is another pseudo-class we can use. It's essentially the opposite of the link pseudo-class, and we can say color green. And now you'll see the AlgoExpert text turns green. Now, in addition to styling based on what the user has already done, such as clicking on a link, we also want to style based on what they are currently doing. So to show this, let's go up to the top of the CSS and let's select an input. But let's not just select inputs, let's select focused inputs. And what the focus pseudo-class does is it selects inputs that are currently in focus, which simply means they are being actively used by the user. Normally, this is when somebody clicks on it with their mouse, but it can also be when they tab over it with the keyboard or a few other things based on the assistive technologies that they might be using. By default in the browser, when we focus an input, it will show up with this light blue outline, but we can change that using CSS. So let's add the outline rule and let's change it to be a little bit larger. So let's say it's a 2-pixel solid blue outline, whereas the default one I believe is 1 pixel. And now you'll see if we focus this, it becomes much larger and more pronounced. In addition to checking if the input is in focus, we also might want to select it based on what the user has typed in. For example, what if we wanted to select only inputs that currently have invalid input? The way we can do that is with the invalid pseudo-class. And what this says is select inputs that do just that. They have invalid input, meaning they are not following the requirements that we set out in HTML. In this case, let's say 2 pixels solid red. Save that and come back to the HTML and let's add a requirement. So let's say it has a minimum length equal to 6. And now if I type, you'll see we get this red outline until we hit 6 characters. But you might have noticed it was a little awkward at the beginning. While I was typing, it was red, but we don't want that to happen to the user. We don't want it to be that they're typing in hello world and it shows up as red before they're even done typing. To understand why this is happening, let's take a look at our CSS. At the top, we have the focus, which is setting it to blue, but then we have invalid below it, which is setting it to red. And in the case where they have typed a few characters and they're still typing, it is both in focus and invalid. So CSS is defaulting to the one lower in the file, which happens to be this invalid one. Now we could simply change the order of the rule blocks, but I think a slightly cleaner way to do this to avoid relying on the order of our file would be to add another pseudo-class. So the pseudo-classes are actually chainable, and we can add the not pseudo-class. And what not does is it takes in a parameter of another selector, and it will select anything that does not fulfill whatever selector we have inside of the parentheses. So for example, we can say not focused. And what this is saying again is select inputs that are invalid, but are also not in focus. And I can save this, and we can come back to our input and start typing, and you'll see it stays blue until we click off of it. And if I were to save it with just hello and click off of it, we would see the red outline because it is no longer in focus and it is invalid. And I think this is a much better user experience than what we might want. Finally, we can also select elements based on their location in the DOM, so what context they exist in. For example, let's come up here to the top and we can select paragraph tags, but I want the first of type. And what first of type pseudo-class says is select the first paragraph in this case. So type being whatever is here. So in this case, it is the paragraph tag. And we want this first one, but the first one of a set of siblings. And let's make this color orange. And when I save, you'll see the go-to text becomes orange because it is the first paragraph on the page. But it's not just because it's the first paragraph on the page, it is because it's the first in the set of siblings. So remember, all of these tags are siblings to each other because they share the same parent. However, if I took these paragraphs down here and added a div around them, so let's move these two paragraphs inside of the div, save, you'll see the first one inside of the div also gets the orange text because now Algo Expert is the best, is the first paragraph in its set of direct siblings, which is just these two paragraphs. In addition to first of type, we can also say last of type, which does just as you would expect. It selects the last one. So if we come back to the HTML, the body, so it's children, so the direct children of the body, there's only one paragraph. So that's why this one is still selected. Whereas inside of this div, there are two. So it selected the second paragraph because that is the last one. In addition to this, we can also use nth of type, which takes in a parameter. And this can be a number. So we could say, for example, 1, and this would again select the first one. This is the same as first of type. We can also say something like even, which would select all of the even ones, or odd. And finally in here, we can do some custom functions. So we could do something like 2n minus 1. And this is actually the exact same thing as odd because 2n minus 1 is the equivalent of odd. So this would select the first, third, fifth, and so on and so forth elements. Similar to nth of type, we have one more pseudo class that does a very similar thing. So we can say paragraph, but let's say first child. And in this case, I'll make this color purple. And then let's also comment out the nth of type selector for a moment so they're not conflicting with each other. And you'll see the first child is selecting just Algo Expert is best. So why is this? Well, what first child does is it says, look at every element. So in this case, we start with the body, for example, and we say, look at its first child. The first child here is an H1. And we say, does this child match the selector here? Well, the first child is not a paragraph, so no, it doesn't. And then we move on to the next element. So we have this paragraph. We say, what's its first child? It's not a paragraph either. And then we move on to this div. We say, what's its first child? In its case, the first child is a paragraph, so it gets styled as purple. Along with the first child, we can also do last child, and we can do nth child as well. So maybe we want nth child and we want even children, or we could do odd children as well. And again, this works very similar to nth of type, with the difference being that this is looking at the child number first and checking to see if it matches the selector, whereas nth of type is just looking for that number of the selector within the sibling set. That will do it for the pseudo classes that we're going to look at today. There are tons more. There are lots of pseudo classes that you can learn and play with that represent almost any state that any element on the DOM can have, and they're super powerful. So I do recommend trying to learn more of the useful ones. But we looked at, I think, most of the most commonly used pseudo classes here. But now let's take a look at pseudo elements, which again, pseudo elements allow us to select certain portions of an element. So let's get rid of this selector up here for the paragraph and add a new paragraph selector, but let's make a pseudo element on it. In pseudo elements, the one difference is they use 2 colons and then the name of the pseudo element. So for example, we can say first letter, And sometimes in paragraphs, you want to take the first letter and do something with it, like make it a different font or make it larger. So we could do font size, and let's just make it 2EM, which will essentially make it twice as large. And now we get this nice design where our first letter is bigger than the rest. And in addition to first letter, we can also do first line, which will match the entire first line. In this case, all of our paragraphs are only on one line, but if we had a multi-line paragraph, it would select just the first line of it, which is pretty cool. But for now, let's put this back to first letter. And next, what I want to look at is something called before and after. So first we have before, and what before does is it inserts an invisible element before the beginning of the content within the paragraphs that are being selected. So for example, we can use this content CSS rule, and what this allows us to do is add some content. So we can maybe add an arrow that points to our content. And I can save this, and you'll see it appears on the left of the paragraphs, although it looks a little bit awkward here with the font size we have. So I'll just remove the dash, and we can just use the greater than sign for the arrow. You'll also notice that the content we add in the before is actually being applied to by the first letter selector. And then finally, after works very similar. So we can say paragraphs after, and maybe here we'll do content and just add an exclamation point to the end of all of our paragraphs, and you'll see each one gets a new exclamation point. One thing you might notice here, though, is that there is a space after Algo Expert before this exclamation point. And the reason for this is that we went to a new line after the anchor tag. So this is one of the few times in HTML where the white space will be noticed. So again, white space is condensed down to a single space. So all of this space here became a space character in the HTML. So this is one of the only times we'll need to put the closing tag on the same line if we do want to use this content after CSS syntax. But of course, this isn't the best way to accomplish this. If we just wanted an exclamation point, we would want to just add that in the HTML itself. But there are times when we do want to add some specific styling at the end of the element, and we can do that using this after pseudo element. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.